I am an African.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Africa for Dummies podcast. We're back with another exciting episode. Um, Obviously, we had our previous one on the church in Africa. If you're interested in that, we talked about lots of controversial things, and please check that out. And also remember to check out our documentaries, which are up on YouTube. Today, we have, of course, a very interesting and wide-ranging topic on women, law, and politics with Miss Linda Kasonde, who is the former president of the Law Association of Zambia and the founder and executive director of the Chapter One Foundation, which is a foundation that looks at constitutionalism and democracy in Zambia. She will be talking to us about various issues, about her personal story, her views on the current situation of law in Africa, in Zambia, and of course, the challenges and the triumphs that women have experienced in Africa and Zambia in particular. Welcome to the Africa for Dummies podcast, Ms. Linda Kasonde.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure. Yeah. So could you just give us a little gist on who Linda Kasonde is? Just a good example of what your journey is. And people, I think a lot of people probably want to know, was law really your calling? Did you always want to do law? Did you want to be something else before?
So, I always call myself an accidental lawyer because when I had finished my international baccalaureate, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But something that my mother had instilled in my sister and I was that as women, it was important to have a profession because whatever happens to you, you'll always have that thing to fall back on. I did always enjoy history and English, and I suppose that's how I ventured into law. But I don't consider it a mistake anymore because once I got into law school, I enjoyed the experience very much, in particular, a topic called civil liberties in my second year, which I suppose has set me on this path. Even though I originally started off working in a sort of in a legal aid clinic, so around human rights, I spent 15 years at a commercial firm and became named partner in that firm before coming back to my human rights roots and setting up Chapter One Foundation, which promotes and protects the rule of law and human rights in Zambia.
So then there's always sort of been a trajectory then into the field of law, human rights in one way or the other then. Would you say
Well,
that?
my father initially thought I'd become a journalist because I enjoyed writing short stories and little articles and things when I was young. But I'm happy to say that I'm now a writer and a lawyer. So I'm sure my dad is proud wherever he is. Yes, I've written a book called Women, Resilience, and the Will to Lead, which is a memoir about my experiences as a woman in leadership on the national stage.
Yeah, and of course that's why we have you here. You've sort of there's sort of a legacy historically of people not writing books, and they have this wealth of knowledge. And I think obviously it's good that you mentioned that book. It's on Amazon, and she's done a few book tours on it. So please, for those who are interested, check it out. And that's why you're here, obviously, as I just said, to discuss on these things and share with those who might not have sort of come across it, or even who are yearning for a story like this and don't know any. So, so now you get elected as the first female president of the Law Association of Zambia, which is the premier association of legal minds in the entire country. So get us into what was going on in your mind upon that election, and in a field really dominated by men historically, what challenges did you encounter, particularly first as the first female president of the Law Association of Zambia, but just as a lawyer and you as a person?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I was very deliberate about my journey to become elected as the president of the Law Association of Zambia. It was something I had aspired to for 7 years, and I worked my way up in the association from an ordinary council, first from volunteering on the committees of the association, to stepping up as an ordinary council member, then honorary secretary, then vice president, and finally president. I think too often, particularly on the continent, our leaders are accidental leaders, and I think we should be more deliberate about these things. And hopefully I exemplify that. But in terms of the challenges I faced, firstly, we live in a very patriarchal society. And at the time, as I mentioned, no other woman had successfully been elected to the position of president of the Law Association of Zambia. And maybe for the listeners out there who are maybe not too familiar with the Law Association of Zambia, the association has a statutory mandate to promote and protect the rule of law, constitutionalism, social justice, etc., as well as to regulate the profession in the country. And the association is often looked up to for guidance on national legal issues and governance issues in the country that are legal in nature.
Yeah.
And so it was no small thing to be elected to that position. It came with huge responsibility, one that I took very seriously, not only to the profession, but also to the public at large. And I mean, I often, and I do quote it in my book, a quotation by a former speaker of, I think it's Congress in the United States, who once said, it's easier to run for office than it is to run the office. And I have to tell you, even running for office was not easy, because we live in a patriarchal world and people didn't expect a woman to be able to manage to run the association at a time where we were just getting into national elections, which meant that the political environment was a bit more heated. And of course, that spilled on to how the affairs of the association were run, because the government that was then elected into office took us down a path that was leading to democratic decline, breaches of human rights and the rule of law. And I believe towards becoming a one-party state.
Yeah, so I mean, you basically came in at a time when the country was at a very huge crossroads, democratically, constitutionally. People really needed sober-minded legal minds to give sort of direction and an opinion on these things. But for now, I just sort of want to focus on your sort of story and what you like try to get us into your mind and how you sort of were able to overcome these things and these misconceptions. What are the type of misconceptions that people had of you, and how did you overcome them, or how did you deal with them in the challenges? So like some people probably listening would want to know, okay, I'm also, maybe I want to stand as president of the Law Association of Zambia one day. I just finished my bar or something like that. What challenges did you face? What did you have to deal with that, you probably just looked at it and said, this is ridiculous? Or, what did you have to tell yourself to overcome these misconceptions?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote my book was to demonstrate that these challenges are not insurmountable. And I think things were a bit rougher for me because I was the first. And I'm hoping that now that people can actually see it, they've seen what it looks like to have a woman in that position, it'll be easier for women coming after me to be able to stand, because they won't first be dealing with, can a woman do it?
Right.
So as I was campaigning for the position, my campaign team received some feedback, such as Linda's too ambitious. Why does she want to be named partner and president of the Law Association of Zambia?
So like asking for too much.
Too ambitious. That's apparently not a good thing, particularly for women. So then there was sort of the biblical argument, in the sense that people would say, doesn't Linda read the Bible? Doesn't she know that men are supposed to be in charge? So that was the background against which I was standing. And it was a given that men should be in charge of powerful organizations. Let's put it that way. But as I said, my call to women in my book is for them to come forward into leadership, because once we have a critical mass of women in leadership, then things that are irrelevant, such as our appearance, and any other, thing around our personal lives, will become less relevant, because it'll be about what we can deliver. And that's something that Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, called for, and I totally agree with her.
Yeah, and she's the one who had the famous debate with the who later became the Prime Minister of Australia. It was quite viral. So that's interesting. I can't believe someone actually said biblically men are entitled to men are entitled to lead. Oh my days. And this is supposed to be the most prestigious, the learned of the society. Yeah, so that's shocking. I didn't expect that would be among the discussions there. Yeah, I had to take that in.
It was a little subtle. Sometimes it was just subtle by
Mm,
even women who probably didn't think they were being sexist at all themselves. Because, as you know, patriarchy is not just about men undermining the capability of women, but it's also women also not appreciating why women should take the helm.
yeah.
So, for example, I remember one woman saying to me, what have you done? And I rattled off a list of things that I had achieved during my then sort of 7-year period at the Law Association of Zambia. And then she said to me, what else? And when I look at the record of the people I was standing up against, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but it was incomparable.
Yeah.
So there's always a higher bar for women. You have to prove yourself more than is expected of men.
Mm, mm. And then, it's fascinating you have the angle that women also perpetuate the same patriarchal sort of putting men in the high pedestal and bringing other women down. Well, I saw there was a talk by a one of the former ministers in Botswana, and there was a TED talk, and she talked about the pull her down syndrome. Um, Obviously, as a man, I'm not qualified I don't have personal experience of this, but it sounded interesting, and it sounds like what you're saying. She called it the PhD syndrome, the pull her down syndrome, that some other women who are achieving would pull another woman down so that they can achieve. Is that a thing, or is that just based on a case by case basis? And why do you think, of all people, why do you think women themselves would participate in patriarchal sort of structures and perpetuate that?
Well, that's just how society is set up. The belief is that men are better leaders, that is their place in society, and the role of women is to support them. And that's not to say that culturally we don't have very strong women figures in our culture. For example, in our culture in Zambia, in the Bemba tribe, the matriarchs are very powerful. Particularly your father's sisters have a very prominent role in the family.
Yeah.
And but only to a certain degree. That is a supportive role, and
Right.
you're expected to be in the background. But when you challenge that norm and try and lead from the front, it then becomes problematic. But I believe that there are many women who have been supportive of my journey. It's not just women who've not been happy to see a woman like me in a leadership position. They have been very supportive women.
Yeah.
But like I said, sometimes it's unconscious bias even amongst women, and then just not understanding the importance of having women in leadership. And I like to tell the story of, it's a story I heard by the Swedish foreign minister. She was speaking on the BBC about the importance of women in leadership. And she gave a story about two warring factions fighting over a river on a map. And at the time in the room, the negotiating room, there were just men present. And when they finally decided to introduce women to the conversation, the woman pointed out that, in fact, that river on the map had dried up many years ago. And so they were fighting over nothing. And it's just exemplifies the fact that you need a diversity of thought at the table to make the best decisions, or at least to have a pool of the best decisions. Because when you restrict women's participation, that's what you're doing. You're restricting potential solutions to some of the greatest challenges that we face, not just in our nation, Zambia, but as humanity.
Yeah. I think that sums it up very well. And that example is just probably an example why we need women in the room who can have a wider picture of the common sense, that what should be common sense might not be present when you have egos locking heads and so on. So we're going to go now into another sphere and look at your human rights endeavors. Um, so you have your legal career is rooted in human rights, and you came at a time when Zambia was at the crossroads of constitutional crisis and levels of authoritarianism increasing. Now, what would you say is the most challenging experience you've had in your career as a human rights advocate in Zambia?
Let me just say that, or maybe just clarify that when I first started working on constitutional and rule of law and human rights issues, that was at the Law Association of Zambia. Zambia was not yet at a crossroads. Okay. For example, when I was president of the Law Association of Zambia, when I was elected in 2016, the incoming government had been in office since 2011 and had already pretty early on shown signs of being less democratic and I guess, not being respecters of the rule of law and good governance. And indeed, eventually, corruption became a major issue in the government. And at the beginning, many people were supporters of the government. They were a populist government and had appealed to, some of the issues that people felt were important to them. And so we were at that time pushing back against somebody who was very popular. And that is never easy. It was not easy to be one of only a handful of voices speaking out against what was going wrong in our country. But as we went towards the end of the 10-year rule of that particular government, which was the Patriotic Front government, by that time, people had begun to see the problems with the ruling party. And most people had been cowered into silence. The country had been divided along tribal lines. Even the church was divided. Professional associations were divided. Basically, it was a strategy of divide and rule. You're either with us or you're against us. And so it led to a very toxic environment, toxic political environment for ordinary citizens who are afraid to express themselves. So, in my book, I talk about what I call the cost of silence. Which is that sometimes you need to put your head above the parapet, because if you don't, it can lead to disaster. And I talk about Zambia is currently very heavily indebted, and we're struggling to come to reach a deal with our creditors to relieve the economic strain that our country is under. And I give the story of, now this was sort of early on in the Patriotic Front government's rule. They had purchased 42 fire trucks at a cost of $42 million.
Yeah, I heard about that one.
Just to give some perspective, apparently those $42 million fire trucks were insured for $250,000. So as you can see, the price was heavily inflated, and just one instance of the many acts of corruption that were conducted by the government. And at the time, a small group of activists led a demonstration outside Parliament buildings to protest against that procurement, and nobody joined in. They were arrested and they were tried, thankfully acquitted. I think it was some charge along the lines of breach of the peace or something, or something against the Public Order Act.
Yeah, which we'll talk about
I
as we continue. Yeah.
Indeed, I often say that if more people had spoken out at that point, perhaps we wouldn't be in the economic situation that we're in now. And that is the cost of silence.
Yeah, the cost of silence. Yeah. So, and so far as the cost of silence, but also, there's a funny quote that goes about, and it hasn't been verified, but it sort of clicks on, and it's always floated around whenever people talk about authoritarianism. It's a quote from Idi Amin, where they say freedom of speech is guaranteed, but freedom after speech, that's a different story. So. Did you face any, did you face any death threats? Did you face any threats to your personal safety in this journey, and especially when it was getting very heated and very polarizing?
Well, one of the things we saw exhibited during the former government in particular was the rise of what we call cadreism. So there was the cadres, as we called them, were, if you like, party militias. So each political party had their own group of militias who would go around terrorizing people. For example, at the markets, they would, levy people to sell goods. At bus stations, they'd also levy people to use the bus stations, and basically were terrorizing citizens, and they were violent. Particularly if you were vocal against the leaders they supported. Some people were killed, some people were beaten up, and some people were stripped naked in public. So they were terrorizing citizens, and that was the real risk. When I was president of the Law Association of Zambia, we took a certain position to support lawyers who were defending the shareholders of the Post newspaper. And that unleashed all manner of...
And sorry, just for our audience, the Post newspaper was one of the largest independent newspapers in Zambia at the time.
It was the largest.
Oh, yeah, the largest.
And the most influential. And there were moves to shut it down. And eventually it was actually liquidated on the basis that they weren't paying taxes. But at that time, ruling party cadres came to the secretariat, the Law Association of Zambia secretariat, in busloads, I think about 6 busloads, bearing banners telling me to sort of abash Linda Kasonde, and basically don't hide behind the association, come out and become a politician, join us, on the political stage. So that happened, and then there was the threat to repeal the statute that creates the Law Association of Zambia. There was also a threat to impeach the Council of the Law Association of Zambia, moved by lawyers who were affiliates of the ruling party. It was a difficult time because you never knew where the danger could come from. There were definitely threats out there, but thankfully I went through that period unscathed, at least physically.
But I can say it does sound like quite an ordeal, because it seems every angle there's a divide and rule, as you said. The professionals also trying to undermine, professionals aligned with the ruling party or whichever belligerent, trying to undermine the authority of the association. Then at the same time, there's the cadreism. At the same time, sounds like a lot of moving pieces trying to attack just what's supposed to be a just association that's constitutionally empowered to do so. But yeah, it sounds like quite an ordeal. And so, when you look at if we can just sort of zone out of Zambia for a bit, when you look at, say, the region of Southern Africa, we see challenges. We talked about the Zimbabwean election just a few months ago, and we saw various challenges there in that election. And we also saw an election in Kenya last year, and they took it to court. Zambia has its own experience of controversial elections, but obviously, beyond elections, there's just the general human rights sphere of, civil liberties and things of that nature. And I think I can probably lump these questions together, actually. The Public Order Act, as we just, as you mentioned, some countries like Rwanda had colonial laws that I think I saw news last year or so, they repealed many of them. And that seems to be a sticking issue, this Public Order Act, that has been there through multiple presidencies. I know in Zambia for sure, but many former British colonies as well have these laws that always they promise to remove, but they don't. And they often are used as a sort of leverage for authoritarian tendencies. What do you think is Africa's biggest human rights challenge? And what's your opinion on this Public Order Act, not only in Zambia, but in Africa as a whole, and in mostly like, developing former British colonies and things of that nature?
I think Africa's biggest human rights challenge is inequality and social injustice. So many of our people live in poverty, and often some of our African leaders seem to want to perpetuate that situation in order to exploit the poor for their own purposes. So obviously, there's also the normal lack of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and just other forms of discrimination that exist on the continent. Basically, let me just explain. The Public Order Act is an act that is intended to manage the gathering of large groups of people. It purports to ensure law and order as people gather, so that there's no people aren't trampled on, there's no fighting between different differing groups. But successive governments have sort of weaponized that law, mainly taking advantage of the lack of clarity with which it is worded, to give themselves more discretion over whether gatherings can take place or not. So typically it's weaponized against opposition political parties and civil society groups who are seen to be going against the government position. And essentially when political parties are in opposition, they all champion the cause of repealing and possibly replacing the Public Order Act, but it seems to be quite a convenient law once they get into office. And that has, led to the hesitation to repeal and replace laws that are inimical to democracy in our country. Because as you know, freedom of assembly, which is also linked to freedom of expression, are some of the bedrock of democracy in any nation.
Yeah. Freedom to gather. That's interesting. And do you think do you think there's any merit in the Public Order Act, or do you think the whole thing should just be redone away with and countries should just come up with their own forms of Public Order Acts? Because it seems to have a stain in various, like especially Commonwealth, former British colonies.
Well, maybe start by saying that the UK still has some form of Public Order Act. So its intended purpose is good. There should be law and order, particularly where there are massive gatherings of people. I mean, you can just imagine, you see it, people picketing on either side, one against a particular cause. And because sometimes these things get heated, they can actually lead to physical violence between two sides. So somebody has to keep the peace. And maintain law and order, or stop people from stampeding. So there is a legitimate purpose for the law. It's just that it's been interpreted conveniently to give the government the power or discretion to allow gatherings to happen. Whereas our reading of it is that government is simply meant to be notified of gatherings and then make sure that they facilitate the policing of the gathering to make sure that it's orderly.
Okay. So this is not something that you have to wait for the government to say, okay, yes, you can do it. It's just, okay, we're doing this and we just need this to help us do it properly.
Well, yes, the law provides for a notification period because sometimes the police need to mobilize themselves. Maybe they'll need a larger group of police officers than they have in a particular locality. So they might have to bring people in. But it's been used to decide whether or not to have the gathering as opposed to how it can be facilitated.
Okay. You have been being the president of the Law Association of Zambia and being one of the leading legal minds in the country. You, as we mentioned and went over before, you have been active in founding the Chapter One organization, and you came to the fore around the time period in Zambia where we're facing constitutional changes. So the popularly known as Bill 10, which is which various enactments and changes would have seen power more concentrated in the cabinet and the president, especially in areas of finance and debt, if I'm correct. That was around 2016 to 18. So just tell us a bit about what the Chapter One organization is and what you wanted it to do, like what its purpose was in the Zambian democratic space. But at the same time, could you also explain to us where Zambia's constitutional situation is now and whether or not you're satisfied with it?
So just to back up a little bit, in 2016, substantial amendments to the Constitution were made. Pretty much all of it was amended apart from the Bill of Rights, which requires a referendum before a successful referendum before any changes can be made. And the referendum that was held to make that decision failed. So we're left with this old part together with a substantially changed constitution. And in 2019, the government tabled a bill called the Constitution Amendment Bill number 10 of 2019 to again make very substantial amendments to the Constitution that would essentially entrench the ruling party in government and make it easier to fire the judges, speaker of the National Assembly. Basically, it was a move to consolidate power and would virtually have created a one-party state in Zambia, which is currently a multi-party democracy. So Chapter One Foundation was actually formed in 2019. So July 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I really started it because I felt that the work that I was doing at the Law Association of Zambia was unfinished. I wanted to create a vehicle through which, firstly, for many years, since I think about 20 years since the death of the late Lucy Sichone, there was no civil society organization that was founded by lawyers and run by lawyers to maintain rule of law, promote human rights, and social justice in the nation. So there was a gap in civil society which I felt needed to be filled. And I was greatly inspired by a Zimbabwean organization called the Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, which has been in existence for about 27 years now. And they have been a rock in Zimbabwe in terms of being the go-to organization to support people who face conflict with the law for political reasons, and also do some social justice work. So I felt that Zambia needed something like that in the country. And so I took a leap of faith and left the law firm where I was a named partner to create Chapter 1 Foundation.
Mm.
And so far, so the stated objectives that the reason we created Chapter 1 was to promote and protect human rights, the rule of law, constitutionalism, and social justice through strategic and public interest litigation, through advocacy work, and also through civic education. And our main mission is to push back on the shrinking civic space when it occurs in our country. And I think by and large, we've been successful in doing that. Since we began, you mentioned the Bill 10 fight. When that bill was tabled before the National Assembly, ourselves and the Law Association of Zambia went to court to challenge its constitutionality. Well, challenge the processes that led to the tabling of the bill, the constitutionality of those. And we were unsuccessful. But as I say, we lost the battle, but we won the war, because it then led to a massive public reaction against the bill. And civil society was very instrumental in pushing that agenda to make sure that the bill did not pass. And of course, the opposition also did its part by not supporting the bill. And ultimately, the government failed to pass it twice. So that was actually a huge, a momentous time for Chapter 1 Foundation. I think we became a household name during that time, but that was not the only thing that we did. We've also challenged the fact that there's a lack of gender diversity and lack of diversity of youth and women in government, which is the case is currently before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. We also challenged the internet shutdown that occurred on polling day in 2021. We became the first litigants to successfully challenge an internet shutdown in Zambia. And we're also currently challenging the constitutionality of the Cybersecurity and Cybercrimes Act, which threatens the digital space in Zambia. So we've done a lot of work in a very short space of time. And I'm where we are. Of course, there's ever room to improve and to expand our reach and our impact, but I think we've gotten off to a good start.
Yeah, that's a massive record. Yeah, and especially in the time where it's extremely bleak, the prospects for democracy in Africa are bleak, and how people even understand democracy is becoming very murky. So the other part of the question was, are you satisfied with the constitution of Zambia right now, as is? Obviously, the previous government, the Patriotic Front that led Zambia from 2011 to 2021, was regarded as, increasing the authoritarian powers of the government of the day. But now there's sort of this current government has styled itself as a new dawn, as more democratic. More emphasis has been put on freedom of the press. But to what extent, obviously, the opposition doesn't necessarily share that view. They feel that they're being squeezed and they're being restricted, and they feel like the ruling party is glossing over their frustrations. So, in terms of constitutionality and the legal structures of Zambia as it stands right now, how satisfied are you with the situation in Zambia, and do you think it's working?
Let me just give a little bit of background. So since our Zambian independence in 1964, Zambia has undergone, I think it's 5 or 6 different constitutional review processes, which have involved a publicly appointed commission to go around the country to get people's views on what they want to see in the Constitution. And of those 5 or 6 processes, the Constitution has been amended substantially, first in 1991, then 1996, and then in 2016. And particularly prior to the 2016 amendments, there was a huge movement in civil society to have what is called a people-driven constitution, because the previous efforts at amending the constitution largely favored the ruling party because they take the final draft and amend it once it got into parliament, removing the clauses that people had been calling for many decades. So in many respects, people regarded the final products that we've seen as failures. But I have to say that 2016 amendments did actually yield quite a lot of results, positive results um, for our constitutional dispensation, in the sense that it almost seems like the government wasn't aware of the implications of certain provisions that it passed through Parliament, which supported democracy and constitutionalism in the country. This is an example of that. It got rid of deputy ministers, which we felt that at ministerial level, the public office was bloated and that there was no longer need for deputy ministers. There was a requirement introduced for anybody to become a member of parliament must have as a bare minimum a Form 5 certificate, a grade 12 certificate.
Yeah.
And that disqualified a lot of people who were in office from recontesting their seats. So there were many there were many provisions that went through, and I'm sorry not to pull out the most salient, but there were many provisions that were actually things that people wanted. And now we already discussed Bill 10 and the previous government's attempt to amend the constitution again. The current government, which was elected in 2021, is again trying to amend the constitution on the basis that it doesn't meet muster. And I think at some point we as a nation have to decide that it's not so much, we'll never get a perfect document. And a constitution is not something to be toyed with. It's not something to be cut and amended at whim, but according to somebody's whim. And that really what we need to be looking forward to is what lawyers term as breathing life into the Constitution.
Right.
So there are many provisions of the Constitution that if we went to court to seek clarity on what they mean, they would solve a lot of problems without necessarily having to revert to constitutional amendments. Because you'll never, ever have a perfect document. And indeed, one of the dangers that we're facing now is in the government's move towards amending the Constitution again. We're actually inching into the next election cycle. And our history as Zambia tells us that often governments in power put in provisions to punish their opponents when making constitutional amendments. So it becomes quite dangerous. And just as an example, the 1996 constitutional amendments barred the first Republican president from recontesting the presidency.
Kenneth Kaunda.
And subsequently, yes, Kenneth Kaunda, and subsequently became a hindrance for the subsequent president in terms of his, his citizenship was queried and all those sort of things. Yeah. So when you try and engineer the Constitution, instead of doing it in the national interest to settle scores or to punish opponents, it becomes a bit of a dangerous document. And I think we should just sort of say to ourselves, look, what we have isn't perfect, but it's a good start, and we can, as I say, give life to it by taking up cases in court to allow the courts to do their job by interpreting the Constitution.
No, I think it's interesting you've talked about that, and how you can't always like toy with the Constitution. I feel like there's so many debates in the when people discuss countries' Constitution. In America seems to have these solid amendments that are almost in like you can't change them. and people sort of even the idea of America and the values of America are like based on the the few solid amendments that they that's what they call them, and the Democrats, Republicans debate across, oh no, First Amendment, Second Amendment, guns rights, you can't take my guns according to this amendment. Freedom of speech, all men are equal according to this amendment. And they've lasted for hundreds and something years now. Um, so over 200 years, sorry. America is over 200 years. And then in the UK, there is no codified constitution. There's just a bunch of statutes and various laws and some gentleman's agreement or traditions. Um, it seems like there's different approaches for constitutionalism. In South Africa, on the other hand, they've had the young constitution in I think it was 1996 when they adopted theirs, and they've sort of followed what you have sort of spoken about, breathing life into the constitution, going through various court cases, and bouncing off of those court cases, challenging the presidency, and two, if not, yeah, two of their presidents have resigned as a result of some of those constitutional challenges, or as a consequence of some of those challenges. Um, so would you then say that the Zambian constitution is fine as it is? It just needs to be nourished, basically, to work. It's a workable constitution. It's not a bad constitution. And also, could you spread some light on what these amendments that this current government is trying to put into place?
Like I said, there's no perfect constitution. Our constitution is largely modeled on the Kenyan and South African constitutions, both of which are very progressive. So we have a good basis from which to interpret or breathe life into the provisions of the Constitution. No one knows what the government is proposing to amend in the Constitution. There's been talk of amending what they call non-contentious clauses versus the contentious, and we don't know what those are or how those have been defined.
Yeah.
So it's unknown at the moment because they haven't yet presented their ideas to the public. But we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, sounds very, very interesting. Sounds like a big mystery that is about to unravel. So yeah, so last question, although no, this is the second last question. Which country in Africa do you believe has the best human rights record, or perhaps the best constitution? Which country do you think is the model for constitutionality in Africa, on the African continent?
So I think in Africa, the South African and Kenyan constitutions are the best ones, but I believe South Africa has a better record post-apartheid of giving effect to human rights, not just civil and political human rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. So there's a wealth of jurisprudence that they've produced that other countries learn from, and yeah, those two countries, I would say.
And also, why is it so hard for, yeah, you spoke about the Kenyan constitution. There was, I think that was in the 2018 or 2017 election when the current president, his re-election was nullified, and he had to have a second run at that election, which he won quite smoothly because the main opposition boycotted. In Malawi, the presidential election was also nullified. But in countries like Zambia, although people don't always compare Zambia and Zimbabwe in terms of their democracies, but you can't impeach the president unless it's like, Zimbabwe is technically a coup. Why is it so hard to impeach an African president? And what do you think? Is it a legal thing? Is it a constitutional thing? Or are people just simply too afraid?
Well, let me start by saying that it's very difficult to impeach a sitting president anywhere in the world. You just have to look at how hard it's been to do it to Donald Trump in the United States. It's really very difficult all over the world, and it should be, because that is somebody who has a mandate from the people of that country, presumably. And so to withdraw that mandate is not something that should be done very easily. But it's different. Impeaching the president is different from the nullification of
Yeah,
election
sorry, the
results.
nullification. Yeah.
It was not done through impeachment. It was basically the court said there were severe irregularities in the election results that warranted a nullification of the result. So that's what happened in Malawi and in Kenya.
And so why is it
the
hard for
reason
that
why
to happen? Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, so sorry, I phrased two questions in one. I was going to say, I was going to give an example of the South African presidents resigning and the contrast of how other African presidents haven't been forced to resign or be impeached. And that was the question you just answered. But then the other question was on the nullifications and why it's so hard to nullify an election when a president is elected, which I gave examples of Kenya and Malawi and so on. So yeah, you can go ahead with the nullification. Why it's so hard to nullify a president election.
Just like impeachment, nullification, the standard set for meeting the threshold to nullify an election is very high. I think in Kenya it's above the balance of probabilities, but lower than beyond reasonable doubt. So still quite high, very high, and it should be again because you're dealing with presumably democratically elected people. And so one mustn't try and manipulate what the will of the people was, and people should be slow to change or to decide that results were not properly attained.
Yeah.
So it's hard everywhere, in fact. I mean, again, I'll use an American example. When Al Gore stood against, who was he standing against? I think it was George Bush.
Yeah.
And there was, he challenged the results in Florida. He was unsuccessful as well. So it's very difficult all over the world.
So this is not something unique to African democracy or anything?
Not at all.
Okay, sure. And then we had a fan question from a lady from the Middle East. She was asking generally about women in the global South. And I think maybe you might have addressed this question already. With regards to your book as well, what does it take for women to be resilient in very high leadership positions, and why do you think there is a lack of women in the highest leadership positions? And perhaps I could also add my question to it, which is a bit of a cheeky question, is would you consider running for office in politics or running for the presidency? Yeah, those are the two last questions that we have.
So with regard to your first question around why there's so few women in leadership, it's because it's so hard. I mentioned as I was speaking earlier that firstly, people set a higher bar for women to enter, to get elected or to be appointed. There's a belief that they need to prove themselves even harder. And then once they get there, they're subjected to misogyny, to bullying, to being undermined in all manner of ways. There's so many risks associated with being a woman. But just to say, I think women, and particularly African women, are extremely resilient. There is so much that is on their shoulders, from taking care of the home, to taking care of extended family, to doing jobs at the highest levels when they do, or even just running a home itself is a mission.
Yeah.
And so much is expected of women that isn't expected of men in society. So it's not that we don't have what it takes. It's that for some reason, society doesn't believe that that is our station in life. We're not meant to occupy such positions. And as I said earlier, we need to find ways of changing people's minds about that, because women are very capable, or they can be. With regards to your second question, I don't think I'm a very natural politician. The reason why I run a human rights organization is because it seems easier to me to stand for justice and truth and what is right, no matter what. And I think politicians might suffer a little bit in that regard.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy with where I am at the moment.
Sure. Okay. I don't think I have any other questions left in my. Oh, no, no. Perhaps I could cheekishly ask the last question with regards to men. Obviously, you know, I am asking the very prominent women and accomplished women in Zambian law and politics, what do men have to do to first to help or to ally with women in so far as women's rights are concerned? I think we've touched a lot on women's challenges and the sort of pull her down syndrome and how women sometimes could facilitate patriarchy and how women can support other women, but how can men particularly help and support?
I'll start by saying that I've been very fortunate in my career to have, very good male mentors and sponsors who've helped me along my journey. And that's really the role that they can play. Firstly, by recognizing the importance of having women in leadership. And then because normally it's them that have access to, um, uh, rooms or seats where women normally aren't found, they can facilitate or smooth the way for women to enter into those spaces.
Right.
And women have shown themselves to be very capable to deliver. One thing I do find, though, is that sometimes some men choose women on the basis of somebody who they think won't challenge them.
Mm,
And that's unfortunate because really success in a democracy or in any organization relies on the ability of the competition of ideas. And so the most successful will win. And again, if you have a small pool of ideas, then maybe you won't get the best ones.
yeah.
So I would encourage people to pick strong candidates regardless of gender.
Okay. Yeah, so that was a wonderful way to close it. This has been extremely enriching and probably among our best in terms of informative podcasts and guests. And obviously, for those who have joined halfway through or have just skipped through the chapters, this is Miss Linda Kasonde. She's just released a new book and she's been on several book tours and still going on other book tours. For those in London, she will be in London to talk about her book and her story. It's called Women, Resilience, and the Will to Lead. She is the former president of the Law Association of Zambia, the eminent legal mind mandated by statute. And she's also the founder and executive director of the Chapter One Foundation, a constitutional and human rights organization in Zambia. We just want to thank you so much for coming on our platform. We have been extremely honored to have you on. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that will comment and have further questions. And yeah, we've loved having you on.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to be here. Appreciate
Sure,
it.
thank you. Thank you so much. Please remember to leave us a 5-star rating, and we hope to see you engage with us, talk to us, and tell us what you want to hear next time. And thank you for listening to Africa for Dummies.
I am an African.